Welcome to Interview, the recruitment podcast. The experts you'll hear from are John Jeltema, who will speak from the recruiter's perspective, Mark Bassett, who represents the candidate's perspective, and Debarshi Chaudhury, who will address the tech employer's perspective to the discussions. This episode of our podcast focuses on the issues of counteroffers. Recruiters hate it when their candidates get a counteroffer, so what are the best ways to deal with it? And also, how do you prepare your client for the possibility of counteroffers? As well as, what are the best strategies to negotiate with the candidate who gets one? Mark, I thought it'd be cool to, you're an expert on the topic, so let's kick it off with you on this one.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish I wasn't an expert on the topic, but if I am, it's because I've encountered them so many times. And if I had a fee for every deal I lost, maybe I'd be retired by now. I work mostly with executives and recruit passive candidates, so they're more often than not employed. And there's one good thing about a counteroffer, and that is it's confirmation to both yourself as the recruiter and to the client that your candidate is viable and valuable, because his employer doesn't want to lose him and is going to do whatever he can to keep him. So that's a good sign. In fact, when they don't come, it's potentially a red flag. But the question often is when do you begin discussing it? When do you bring it up? What do you do when you've got someone who's at high risk for a counteroffer? And if you begin the discussion of what's going to happen at the point where you're actually extending your candidate an offer from your client, that's just going to be too late. Not only because there's so much ground to cover, but also because you're going to be suspect because you've got a lot at stake. And obviously you want him to take your job or her to take your job. So, when do I bring it up? I bring it up at the very first in the interview process. And, there's many schools of thought on this, but, if I ask him or her early in that interview, when he resigns, what are you going to do when you get a counteroffer, or what? I'll even presume he's going to, and just say, at what point could the counteroffer, at what level could the counteroffer change your mind? What's an acceptable counteroffer to you? And to begin it at that stage, and to begin talking with your client about it, now it becomes a point of reference that you can talk about it openly, right? So, for example, Danny Cahill's kind of famous for this. He kind of described the counteroffer as not an event that occurs, but as a process, right? It's not just the candidate goes in and resigns and the employer says, hey, we didn't know you weren't happy here. How about we increase your salary by X? That, in fact, it's a 2-week process that's going to be chipping away over that whole period of time that person has resigned. And it's a strategy, They might use a guilt trip. They might use money. They might use fear, any number of things in any number of attempts. So it's not that you're just preparing him for this one particular event. You've got to prepare this candidate for a whole 2-week process.
I agree. I mean, it's to me, from looking at it from the other side, where I have made a number of counteroffers to people I've thought were too valuable to lose. I do see that as essentially when they resign and I really want to keep them. For me, they're not gone until they're actually gone. You know what I mean? Of course, some people I'm happy to lose. That's easy. But the people I'm not happy to lose, I'll, again, as you said, make them monetary offers, try to give them a promotion if that's what it takes. It's really, I will chip away at them. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, sometimes their mind is really made up and they will leave. But it has worked, I would say, at least 25 to 30% of the time where they've eventually switched back, changed their mind, stayed on board, and carried on. And so, yeah, from a recruiter's perspective, I'm sure that must have sucked. But from my perspective, that really worked out. And I guess the question really is, I mean, how would a candidate project that, though, in the sense that do they have and in your experience, do they usually have a sense of what their employer is going to come back with if they resign?
No, more often than not, I think it's the opposite. There's 2 things I hear most commonly when I first bring it up, and one is oh, my employer doesn't make counteroffers, it's a policy. And I laugh at that because, at the very least, if the person's valuable, they're going to make every attempt, and they're certainly going to not publicize it. They don't want everybody to know that, hey, come in here and resign, and you can get a 20% raise, right? The second thing I hear, and the most common thing I hear, is when the employee is the candidate saying, hey, don't worry about it. Listen, once I make up my mind, I'm a man of my word. I don't change my mind. If I commit to a company, then I'm going to stay, and then I'm going to join them, and I'll stick with my decision. And I laugh at that because that's exactly what I heard from every person who's taken one. And I think the most common approach that recruiters take is to imply that they're evil. In fact, we used to quote a antique Wall Street Journal article that indicated that 80% of people who accepted counteroffers were not in their jobs within the following 6 months, whether that was because the employer opted to replace them and just bought some time, or because the issues, the motivation, the reason that the candidate was looking for a job in the first place never really was addressed with a couple of more dollars or with a little bit more money. So that was a pretty powerful article. But the problem is that most people would put themselves in that 20%. They say, my boss is not an ogre. He's not a monster. We've worked together for 6 or 7 years. And just from what Debarshi just said, you could tell that, he's not extending that counteroffer necessarily as a strategy for retaining him. He's legitimately interested in keeping him. And it's not about, although I think, John, you probably have had a few of these too. How many confidential searches have we done where the position that we're working on, it was as a result of, hey, I've got an unloyal person here who just gave notice. He was going to work for a competitor. I gave him a 50% raise, but they have no real intention of paying that 50% raise because, now all of a sudden I've got a search assignment to go replace this guy confidentially. So it's a big, it's a really muddied water place. And the first and most important thing I suggest, and we need to do this very early in the process for it to work, is examine the motivations of the candidate. Why is he looking? And we were always taught that if he's looking for reasons of convenience, reasons that can be easily addressed, whether that's money or travel or any number of things that can be fixed, title, scope of role, then you've got a much higher at-risk candidate there. Whereas if there's significant reasons that no matter what can't be changed, it might be the company's relocating, it might be you've moved further away from the job, it might be that you don't trust the ethics of the organization. Those are better reasons, right? But in either case, what I'll do is advise the candidate, and tell him you've got every right to discuss your future with the company. If there's something the employer can do to address your concern, go have that conversation now when there's nothing at stake, and say, hey, I want to talk about my future in this organization, and get specifics. What title, when will it happen, how much more salary, what scope of role. If he's done that properly, he sat down with his boss, they've had this discussion, and most of the time he gets platitudes or gets kind of strung along. Now, all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, when he goes in to resign because he's accepted my client's offer, and all these huge promises are on the table, you can be automatically suspect. It's like, we just talked about this 3 weeks ago. Why have we had to wait until I've resigned? John, have you encountered anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's the key is exactly what you talked about. You got to hit it in the first conversation. When we're, a lot of times as a recruiter, we're meeting these candidates for the first time. We're building a fast relationship, a fast friendship for the purposes of taking them through one particular search project that we're doing for a client, and hopefully others if we've built a good enough relationship and the candidate's well worth representing elsewhere as well. You gotta find out their motivations. Why are you leaving? What are you looking to accomplish? What are you trying to fix? What I tend to ask that question repeatedly until I get the full picture, because usually it's not just one reason. If it is just one reason, like Mark said, it'd be suspect. Okay, I'm looking for more money. Well, that's the biggest red flag ever. But if you're looking for a better commute or you're looking for a better project or things like that, that's great, but what's the combination? If there's a combination of things, the more reasons they have to leave, the more we have to work with when we need to get them remind them of the reasons they're looking to leave in the first place when that offer comes out towards the end. And then what we got to do is continue to reinforce those concerns and their kind of preferences, if you will, for the type of job or opportunity they're looking for. Got to reinforce that throughout the interview process with our particular client. Even though not everything will be 100%, we want to emphasize or need to emphasize those things, again, reasons for leaving and the reasons they want to get into this particular new opportunity. Because at the end, like Mark said, you don't want to be bringing up the counteroffer at the very end. You need to bring it up piece by piece all the way through the process. I can tell you in the first conversation, if I have any kind of inclination, and I try to do this with most candidates, but it doesn't always happen. But okay, so what's going to happen when we get to the end of this process and this outstanding opportunity we put in front of you? This company presents an offer that falls exactly in line with what you're talking about. You go back to your employer and say, hey, I've got this new opportunity. I'm going to leave. I appreciate everything you've done for me, and so on and so forth. And your employer is going to come back and say, okay, well, can you tell us a little bit about why you're leaving? What kind of triggered this? Well, it was something about my boss, or it was something about my project, or maybe it was money, or maybe location, or whatever. They're going to, whatever reason the candidate gives them, they're going to fix that problem. They're going to fix that issue, and they're going to make it look phenomenal. Oh, here's a better project. Oh, here's, we'll move you over to this team and get a better boss. Here's more money. You can work from home 2 or 3 days a week, which you didn't have before. The challenge is to help the candidates understand that these are temporary fixes that the hiring manager or the company may or may not follow through on. And if they do, it's probably temporary, and they're going to find a replacement for you in the first 6 months anyhow. They're going to put the ball in their court and take it out of yours. So there's another piece to this too, and that's the fear factor. Especially when we're talking about direct hire positions, and although we have a lot of talent that move jobs more frequently these days than they used to. But every time you make a job move, especially if they've been in an organization for an extended period of time, 3, 4, 5 years or more, it's an emotional change. They're got used to their environment, and now they're going into kind of a strange new place that, albeit exciting, it's still a strange new place. And so that emotional factor is really hard to narrow down. But if you can really set those expectations up front, when that emotional factor kicks in at the end, when the offer is sitting in front of them, they got to decide. Then you can help them by reminding them of those reasons they wanted to leave, the reasons that their current situation is not the best situation for them, and the reasons why this new opportunity is the best option for them. So those are the things that we reinforce at that point.
And they'll reinforce that fear factor too. I mean, you talk about. I think it's in proportion to how long the person has been employed there. I mean, imagine. If you've been in a job 5, 7, 9 years, these are as much family as they are, professional acquaintances, and it's almost like getting a divorce. Part of the challenge is, and we should even talk about, coaching them to how to resign, because if you've been there a long time, you're gonna make a lot of excuses, and the most common is very wishy-washy. Most people resign. They're like, I'm really happy here, and I really love my job, and I wasn't looking. I don't want you to get the wrong idea, but I got this call from the headhunter, and they described this amazing opportunity, and I thought, why not? I'll look at it. And then one thing led to another, and it just kind of snowballed. And what the employer is hearing is, give me any reason at all to stay. Right? It sounds as if he's so reluctant to be leaving that all they need is, and sometimes that's really all it takes, is hey, you don't know how important you are to us and what a big part of the family and the team you've become. And oh boy, didn't you know we were rolling out this big regional promotion for you that we were going to wait about a month or two, but we might as well talk about it now. All the more reason why we need to have that candidate have that discussion in advance so they can't spring something like that. But it doesn't take much. And they'll play on fears. Where are you going? Oh, you're going there? Or they'll play on his own insecurities. You've been successful here because of the team, not because of your own contributions. And that sounds awfully evil. But, in Debarshi's point is well taken. Like, he's going to make an extended encounter offer when he's got a resource that he wants to keep and is important to him. And that, who doesn't want to hear that? Compared to all the unknown factors and the fear factors of going into a new organization, needing to reestablish your credibility, having to start basically over again. Even though all the right reasons were there for taking the job, employers will play on that fear. And when we discuss it as a process, I'm talking about as simple. Here's the biggest red flag. When he does give notice, if the employer either says, I need you to think about this, or I need to think about this for a couple of days, or need you to think about this for a couple of days, let's keep this between you and me at this point. I guarantee you, if that's what he's suggesting, he's trying to keep it quiet in the company. He's got plans to chip away at this candidate. And that's a process. He might try a guilt trip first. How could you leave us? 3 days later, it'll be the opposite. It'll be rewarding. It'll be, look how much you've done for us and how important you are. And all the way through to the second, to the hey, let's have a going away meal with the CEO. Bring your spouse, and it's that 14th day. It's that end of 2 weeks where it might finally be unveiled at a dinner where the CEO is walking in and he's being prepped by an executive. He doesn't even know the guy's name. It's like it's Jeanette. Okay, so hi Jeanette. I just wanted your spouse to know, John, how important Jeanette's contribution has been to this company. And all we've benefited from that, and we'd like to make an offer for you to stay. And boy, if the spouse is involved in that, and we're talking significantly more money than we've already offered and extended, that's a really, really difficult thing to undo and very hard to resist, especially since the spouse doesn't have to do that job. So
right.
That kind of reward.
My question is from the other side of the equation, right? I mean, your client who's already made this person an offer, what can they do to protect against this? I mean, I understand obviously the current employer of the candidate is trying to keep them. What's really in the hand of the person who wants to bring this person on?
They got to personalize it as much as possible. So meeting in person, having lunch, having a dinner, meeting up with coffee, talking about their progress, any questions they may have, fill in any blanks. They need to continue to interact with the potential employee. And of course, that needs to be or should be collaborated with the recruiter who's reinforcing and doing more of the same. So, ultimately, the company has to continue to make themselves desirable to the resource, to the talent, right. and kind of infuse themselves in that process.
I think they also need to. They also need to bring it up. If it's just the recruiter who's talking about it, who obviously has a big thing at stake, that's one thing. But if the hiring manager on the second interview says the same thing and says, "Hey, Jeanette, what's going to happen when your employer offers you a 50% raise to stay?" And she'll say, "Oh, they would never do that." And have the employer say, "Well, look, what we're considering hiring you for here is the reason we're considering is the contribution you made there. You own the whole product line over there, or you're responsible for an $18 million book of business, or all the architecture is in your head. They can't afford to lose you, so of course they're going to do everything possible to get you to stay." And to at least make that conversation more than just the recruiter having that conversation, because now all of a sudden it does become real, and now you get their commitment, and you can probe as to what would be acceptable or not acceptable. Debarshi, I'm curious, has there ever been a time where you've given a counteroffer with, let's call it, dubious intent, meaning, maybe you found out where the guy's going, you're not pleased about that, it's a direct competitor, and, your intent is, okay, because companies don't like to be fired. We like to do the firing. So I'm just curious, have you ever done that to retain somebody, but never quite looked at them the same way again, or not trusted them the same way?
Yeah, the trust factor definitely suffers, right? At least for a while, until they can almost prove themselves again. I'm looking at them from a different lens after this has happened. But yeah, I've never really given a counteroffer with the intention of replacing them. The only reason I give counteroffers is if I want to keep them. Otherwise, it's I figure out a way. I might ask them to stay longer or serve a longer notice period if they're doing something really critical and we can't afford to lose them. So maybe I can ask them to serve out, instead of doing this typical 2 weeks, I can ask them to stay for a month and wrap up their project. But again, that's not really a counter offer. It's just, okay, I might incentivize them. I give them some extra money for that extra month. And once they wrap up, they leave. But if I actually make a genuine counter offer where I increase their salary or give them a promotion, whatever the case might be, at that point, I want them. But the relationship definitely suffers, at least for in the short term. And there's really no getting around that. It's like because you now know that they can be lured away, and so you have to be on the watch out in the sense, and on the watch out, I mean, effectively, I would start thinking about, okay, do I now need backup for this person? Maybe I need to train somebody else to take over that person's job if in the situation that they leave. So these are things that obviously now become more critical in my head, and these are things I might have put aside in the past, but now actively start figuring out how to get a replacement in place. Not a replacement, but really a backup in case I need a replacement.
The consequences. I think it's important that we share the potential consequences with the candidate as to how that's going to go over. Just like you mentioned, there may be some suspicion now from the employer's perspective that you're no longer the loyal employee. Think about this too. There's also a lot of peer resentment. If this is one of 6 people on a team, and obviously somebody is given references, or people are going to know no matter what, right? So now all of a sudden this guy's sticking around and he must have gotten a nice little bump. Even his peers aren't going to look at him the same way. When I know a recruiter in Houston, I won't mention her name, but she had a policy of whenever she heard back from the candidate that he's successfully given notice, that next day she would send a balloonogram to the office. Congratulations on your new position, just to make sure everybody knew that he'd accepted a position, and if he sticks around, it's going to be little consequences. So, I mean, that might be dirty pool, but that's the extent to which some people are willing to go, and understandably to undo these things, because who doesn't want to hear how important they are? Who doesn't want to hear, what their contribution is? So, we need to be talking about it often and early. And John mentioned, the emotionality of the process, and that's so true. When you're having the conversation with a candidate intellectually, it's a rational discussion, and it's about, him leaving the company and his next step in his career, or, what her observations are and what her concerns are. But it gets emotional, when they go in and resign. And I think part of what we need to do is coach them through the resignation process, give them actual words, such as, let's not embarrass each other. Thank you for my time with the company. This has been so valuable to me. I've made a decision in the best interest of my career and family. Let's not embarrass each other with any discussion about what it would take to get me to stay. I've made my mind up, and I'm looking forward to moving on to how can I help replace myself. That's a lot better than, hey, I wasn't looking and I got this call and I'm really happy here, begging the process, right?
Right. There's a key to this too that we've kind of touched upon, but maybe I haven't dug deeper on it. It's really about building that relationship with the candidate. And quite frankly, if your relationship isn't as trusting or deep enough, the candidate isn't going to give you the opportunity to prep them for that exit interview with their employer. They're not going to, maybe tell you the full picture of why they're looking to make a change or what opportunities that are going to be most exciting to them. It's imperative that we get as close and in tune with that particular candidate's situation, so that we can be ultimately effective in helping them through the counteroffer process. If they don't allow us to do that, it's kind of like a submit and pray, right? Send a candidate, hope it works out, and we can do everything in our power to try to infuse ourselves. But if the candidate's not willing, for whatever those reasons might be, then and we haven't built as deep of a relationship as we need to with them, then there's a very small or low limit to our ability to help them through this process. So building that relationship, getting to know them, having that kind of vibe with the candidate, that mutual trust, that we become fast friends, and that starts in conversation one, is so important for us to be effective at the end and the end goal, where the counteroffer comes into play. And of course, being their confidant, right? Being their strategist, being the candidate's trusted advisor. That's what we need to be and not just their recruiter, and really not as a recruiter, because if they see us strictly as the recruiter, they probably see us as somebody that's trying to make a transaction out of them. They need to see us as somebody that is really there in their best interests, to help them through thick or thin. I oftentimes will tell my candidates, hey, it doesn't matter to me whether you take this job or not. I've got somebody else I've got as a backup for this position. It's okay. But I tell you, if you want this job and we've taken you through the process and you've learned everything, you say, this is it. I want this. I'm going to do everything in my power to help you get it at the level you need it for the compensation, et cetera. But you and I got to keep up with each other. We got to, it's got to be a scratch each other's, back situation. So when you give notice, you got to allow me to help you, navigate that process and give a notice. And when you get a counteroffer, because you will get a counteroffer, you and I got to strategize through that counteroffer, because it's always there to throw off your emotions and to throw off your decision-making process, which you've already made by the time that counteroffer happened. You had already accepted another offer. So you are already set to go to that new place. So allow me, or allow us, to help you navigate that. Now, if you're in a similar situation like us, where we've got a recruiter that might be doing the first round and an account manager like myself oftentimes doing a second round, you've got two different options. You got a recruiter that may have a better relationship than the account manager, or vice versa. Pick and choose which person on your team is going to be the best one to help navigate that person through the counteroffer process.
It's also important to find out what their experience has been. What are you dealing with, right? So look at the person's resume. You've changed jobs 5 times in the last 13 years. What's been your experience with counteroffers? Have you ever received one? Did you ever accept one? If they've had a positive experience, and you know what, many people have, I've actually had that experience myself, and it turned out to be the best decision I made, and I stuck around for another 12 years as a result of it. So, dealing with somebody in that circumstance, you're going to have a much harder time with scaring them out of it or talking them out of it than you would if they say, oh, I've had one before, and then ended up being laid off in 4 months, or, oh, not me, but my buddy did, and they bumped up his salary, and then all of a sudden it seemed like, he was just never accepted in the company again. If you can find out what their personal experience has been, kind of the same way we want to do with clients, right? What's been your experience with agencies when you've got a new one that might be skeptical or hesitant? If you're armed with the right information, you'll be that much more effective in trying to dissuade them and to resist it.
Okay. And from the employer's perspective, there's one thing that I based on what John said earlier, there's something that's almost like an epiphany. The one thing that we tend to do is we make an offer, we negotiate the salary and all the terms around the job, and then we expect the candidate to put in their notice and start working 2 weeks later. But for those 2 weeks, the person is actually with their current employer 8 hours out of the day, and we have zero contact with them. Right. For those 2 weeks, we've given up contacting them because we expect them to start 2 weeks later, but we're really not reaching out. And I think it's something that, this is something I'm going to talk to my team about, and potentially we could incorporate this in our hiring process. But really, setting up maybe just lunches or drinks or whatever the case might be with these candidates through that 2 week period, so we have regular touch points with them, because that, I think, will go a long way towards basically building that relationship with the new employer, and as they're weaning off the relationship with their old employer. And the situation that I think we talked about sometime earlier, where the CEO shows up on the last day and makes a spectacular offer that they can't resist, it becomes easier to resist them if they've spoken to the other CEO a day earlier and confirmed the plans for the new job. So it's just, this is my takeaway from this podcast. I mean, this is really very important for me, is that we cannot just send them the offer letter, and once it's signed, we just step back and say, okay, see you in 2 weeks. That's something we should absolutely not do as employers.
Yeah. Again, goes back to the submit and pray, perspective, right? You've made the offer, and yeah, you fully expect them to start, but man, so much happens, in those 2 weeks. And I learned early on, you look for touch points, ultimately reasons to call somebody, whether it's a client or a candidate or somebody that's been made an offer and has verbally or even has signed at the dotted line, and ultimately. Touch point might be, hey, how did your exit interview go? How is it wrapping up? This part of the process or this project that you were working on. How's the transition going to to somebody else on your team? Did they find somebody that you can hand off the work that you were doing? Or maybe they have a backfill for that matter. Did they start to search yet? For your replacement. Any of those things can be reasons. To have a touch point with that person post offer, and you just look for those. You make the call, and you have a live conversation, right, in person or over the phone. We don't just send an email or a text or whatever. That's so easy. You got to have a live conversation, because then you can better gauge. So, how is your spouse doing through this process? Et cetera, et cetera. So, hey, can we meet up? I'd love to meet with your spouse or, family or whatever might be appropriate. When can we do that? I'd love to meet with you before. Another touch point might be, hey, I'd like to go over, this report and these things that might, help you kind of start getting acclimated even before you get started. Can we meet to do that? Whatever the reasons are, you got to have those touch points, and you probably should have at least 2 or 3 touch points at key times between the offer acceptance and the start date.
Yeah, especially like the employer, like Debarshi said. I mean, you need to give them reasons and bring them in on as to why. Because exactly right, that 2-week period is very biased, right? So if the employer, has a couple of questions or wants to give them some advanced material or just to check in and to confirm how excited they are, to empathize with how difficult it is during a resignation period. What kind of resistance are you getting? Are they playing in any games with you? I tell the candidate too that 2 weeks resignation is a courtesy, not a requirement, right? And so that if I've given notice and I've said, let's not embarrass each other with any discussion about what it would take to get me to stay. And if they continue to chip away at me, whether that's a guilt trip or a counteroffer or, promises, I don't need to sustain that notice. I can leave, with my head held high because they're not ending up carrying their end of the bargain. There's a lot of fear involved in this, right? There's the fear of a new position, no matter how excited they are. And that's another conversation to have with a candidate, is to say, look, there's good fear and there's bad fear. Have some confidence in the new CEO or the new executive team who sees in you what they need, and don't let that negative self-talk kind of talk you away from that. They're super excited about you as a fit, and they know you're going to be good. And a certain amount of fear is healthy, right? It's that performance fear. It's that fear we might have before we do a public speaking event, or that fear we might have before meeting, an important person, whether that's, a date or a spouse or a boss or a potential, that's a good fear. That's what keeps you on your toes. You want that. That's your energy. That's your juice. But it's that mind clouding fear of, I'm not up to this. They don't know who I really am. That trust me, no level of seniority cures. And this is just as common with executives as it would be with entry level people. So, the only way you can do that is, like John said, having a decent enough relationship where you can get that personal and get that level of trust where they can have this kind of discussion.
Right. And I would try to convert that fear into excitement, really, and especially in the tech industry. And that's something that could sort of achieve both goals, converting the fear into excitement and giving you enough touch points. Basically get them excited about their new job and the new technology they would potentially be working in. And we all know essentially any tech job it's maybe 10 to 20% new and exciting stuff, but 80% is grunt work, just like any other job, really. But they don't need to see that up front. I mean, there's a lot of excitement that can be generated based on the new technologies or the emerging technologies that your company is working in, and giving them exposure to that, right? Whether it's AI, whether it's machine learning, blockchain, whatever the case might be, it's get them excited, right? I think that's and so that they're already looking forward to working on these cool new things, and at that point they've already given up, at least mentally, they've given up what they used to work on. Right, and if you reach that point, then I think the chances of a counteroffer succeeding are fairly low.
I agree with that, but I kind of don't agree with that because, quite frankly, that's going to be absolutely accurate for some and not for others. This is why, in that first conversation and throughout the, with the candidates and throughout the interview process, you're really understanding what their motivations are. So if their motivations are latest technology and that's what your client's opportunity has for them, that's what you reinforce. If their motivation is larger project, smaller team, startup environment, smart people, whatever those reasons are, those are the things that you emphasize with that candidate. Regardless, they may still be a technologist, but their priority is to get a cool team that are mostly PhDs. And where they can kind of learn and be mentored and things like that. Great. Then that's what, if that's what your client has, that's what you reinforce. So it really all depends on the individual. Technology, yes, that can be true for most people in technology, but not all. I find a lot of them are really about having that right work environment or a work-life balance or opportunities to work remotely or whatever it is. There's so many different, reasons why people come and go. And so you just got to emphasize those reasons for that specific individual in that specific situation.
The other thing I would suggest is to increase their expectations, that if this is going to come, I'll tell stories about circumstances where a person was given an executive title, given outrageous amounts of equity, maybe made a 50% raise in their salary to get them to stay, so that now when the employer matches it with a paltry, so what do they offer you? Okay, we can match that. He'll be frustrated. Hey, where's my 50% increase in salary, right? One thing John said that reminded me of I don't know whether, I've never done this and I'd like to try, but I know one executive recruiter who says, we are the agent of the candidate and we're representing the client, as an agent as well. As the candidate's agent, I offer to, he would say he offers to resign on that candidate's behalf in order to, put a sock in it, make sure it doesn't happen. And while I haven't done that, I have done this. John mentioned that, asking the candidate, have they started the search for your replacement yet? I've actually called in once we've known that's happened and owned it and said, hey, I'm the person who took, Jeanette out of the job. Nothing personal. She's a great resource. Maybe I can help you replace her. And I've gotten many searches that way, There's a little bit of, awkward discomfort in the idea of approaching it, but, you might as well insert yourself in the situation and know what's going on, right? And that might also be able to bring you new business. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff, but we need to do all of these things every time because there's nothing worse than losing, a huge deal where you've done every other thing right to, the last minute. That phone call from there's nothing worse, right? That phone call from the employer on the day they're supposed to start at 9:30, and where's Joanne? Oh no, can't have that happen.
That's your alternative to the balloonogram, right? It's just to jump in there and fuse yourself. Exactly. So it makes sense, and you'll find out, of course, whether they gave notice or not. And of course, if you're breaking news, then anyhow, is what it is. But obviously you want to find out from the candidate if, reconfirm that they gave notice and let them know, hey, I'm going to be calling your boss to help backfill your position.
Tell the candidate when he resigns that we're waiting in the wings with a couple of viable options that might be appropriate. That could actually be very positive and very responsive, that he's making a proactive effort to get himself replaced or herself replaced.
Well, especially since you have backup candidates, right? From the search you were doing for the existing client, that may, even though they weren't a best fit for that client, maybe a best fit for the new one, right? And of course, understanding what your client was looking for by recruiting the right person out of that organization. Well, that organization sell the value in the person you recruited out of them, so that you know exactly what kind of person they're looking for. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Let's wrap it up on dealing with a counter offer. Maybe we could just go with a couple key, 1-2 punch highlights from each one of you. Mark, you want to kick us off with your key takeaway?
Sure. I would say, 4 things, right? Let's talk about it early, and let's talk about it often. Number 2, let's send them back to have that future discussion of my employment with the company before it's at a critical stage, while we're at the beginning of our interview process. 3, make sure we involve the client in that discussion, have him bring it up too. And 4, let's not consider the offer accepted and in the resignation as a done deal, but to stay with that candidate through that process, involve the employer, and make sure he's or she's right up to the final Friday, ready to start on Monday.
And I would just reiterate that basically, from an employer's perspective, it is very, very important and that we keep in touch with the candidate even after we think it's a done deal. We've signed the contract, we've negotiated the contract, we've done all of that. We expect the person to start in 2 weeks. We cannot just sit back and wait for the candidate to start in 2 weeks. We have to keep continuous touch points. We have to keep them involved in the process, get them excited in the new job. And that's really the only surefire way of making sure that they'll actually start in 2 weeks.
And for me, build the relationship with the candidate that has that foundation of trust, and be their advisor and be their strategist, and be their go-to person to help navigate what can be a very emotional situation. But build that relationship with the hiring manager so you can understand the key elements of the organization, what they bring to the table, that is going to be so pertinent through the interview and hiring process for the right resource they want to hire for the role.
All right, let's jump into our last segment of the show, the recruitment tool of the week. What is it this time?
Sure, I can take that. So basically, there's a tool called Recruiting.net. And what that allows recruiters to do is really search through LinkedIn accounts without having a LinkedIn account or using their own LinkedIn account. So basically, a large chunk of LinkedIn accounts are searchable on Google, and most people keep it that way. So what Recruiting.net does is uses Google search engine to search through LinkedIn. So in a sense, you're bypassing LinkedIn search engine, and you're going straight to the source. And this is, if you think about it, Google's search engine and search tools are significantly more powerful than LinkedIn's. So not only do you get the LinkedIn search results, but you can also potentially get search results from other sources in the same interface. And but if you're able to use this properly, it can significantly reduce the time to make an effective search.
In addition, it searches on Google+, Twitter, Stack Overflow, GitHub, and various other sites. And I suspect over time they'll add additional sites that the tool will search on as well. So it has a broader range than necessarily than just LinkedIn.
All right. Well, thanks for listening in. If you have any comments or suggestions for the topics that you want us to discuss in the future, reach out to us via email at interview@inamics.com or on Twitter. So we'll be back soon with more content and suggestions about how to make your staffing operations simpler and more efficient.